reporter offering a commentary on a CBS morning news program talked about traveling in an African country. It was a country where the native language was not English. But on her way from the airport to where she was staying, she conversed with the cab driver, whom she said not only spoke English very well, but was also familiar with what was going on in the United States at the time, who our leaders were and what current events were in this part of the world. He was particularly interested when he found out that she was a reporter talking to her about stories that she was there to cover. After a while, they had sort of played that out, and so just making small talk, he asked what part of the United States she's from. And she said, well, I'm from the southeastern part of the United States, from Louisiana. I grew up in the city of New Orleans, thinking that would be familiar to him. But he didn't know where New Orleans was. It was not a city that was familiar to him. So trying to talk to him about what it is, she said, well, you're probably more familiar with the cultural heritage for this area. New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz, the home of Louis Armstrong. But he didn't understand either of those references either. And she said she was surprised and a bit taken back. She said this man was intelligent. He spoke my language. He knew about our politics and our public life. But if he didn't know New Orleans, jazz, or Louis Armstrong, he didn't know our soul. Jimmy was the pastor of my home church, and he led a 4-week-long small group on soul music. People were invited to come and to gather for this informal group that he led. Where we brought music to share, he asked us to bring music that speaks to our soul. To guide us, he had some readings from Professor Don Salyers, a professor of worship and sacred music at my alma mater. He's also the father of Emily Salyers of the folk duo The Indigo Girls. And the two of them have written a book about the sacred nature of music, both sacred or church music, as well as secular music as well. And Jimmy led us through these 4 weeks as we shared music that feeds our soul with one another. It was a wonderful time to get introduced to music that might have been new to us, songs, albums, artists, in some cases genres that weren't that familiar to us. But the most amazing thing about this 4 weeks is we got to know each other on a very deep and personal level. I believe that spending 4 weeks listening to people share about the music that speaks to their soul is more intimate than reading someone's diary. Soul music. Let's consider what that is and what it does for us. National Public Radio had a feature many years ago about a man who was facing a terminal illness. He is someone who back in the 50s and 60s ran and operated a number of clubs along the eastern coast. And as he was a promoter and a lover of what was then known as beach music, music that kind of took the 4/4 dance style and combined it with lighter sort of rock and roll influences of the time, before the West Coast and the Beach Boys began to redefine that. The kind of thing that teenagers would have danced the shag to. And it was an extremely moving story as they talked about this man who was in a wheelchair, and he was surrounded by musicians and lovers of this music who gathered for one last great concert to celebrate the music that he had devoted his life to promote it. The most moving part of that segment, though, came a few days later when someone wrote in about her reaction to the story. She said, "I am an adult. My children are grown. And I live in Alaska now, where it's the middle of winter. And that means we haven't seen the sun for over a month. And there are feet of snow outside. But I grew up on the coast of South Carolina. And when I heard your special about beach music, it was as if the sun came through the clouds, the snow melted off my car, and I was a teenage girl dancing on the shore without a care in the world." Soul music speaks to that part of us that never grows old. A teenage girl was going through a hard time with peer pressure and other troubles that were plaguing in on her. She was a bit of a maverick who didn't quite fit in. And the pressure got to be a lot for her, and she wasn't telling other people what was going on with her, and she was at the point where she was very seriously considering committing suicide. This teenage girl was a fan of heavy metal, a genre of music that's known for distorted amplification and dark and brooding lyrics. And one night, when she was very close to taking her own life, she put on some music she enjoyed. And she heard a song from lyricist and songwriter Dave Mustaine called "In My Hour of Need." And it's a song that touches what the Psalms touch sometime, when they talk about what it feels like to be deep in the bottom of the pit, at the gates of Sheol, facing and looking at death. And as she listened to that song, she realized that she wasn't the only one who had felt the way she did. That somebody else had experienced what she had, and she felt a connection. Heavy metal, a music not known for saving people's lives. Soul music lets us know that we are not alone. The weekend after September the 11th, 2001, I called my dad and was talking with him about the events of that week and what it had been like and his reflections and what was going on. And toward the end of the conversation, I was living in Atlanta at the time, and I told him that the classical music stations there had been playing a lot of things from the Robert Shaw chorale. Robert Shaw, the great conductor of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. And they were doing requiem pieces like selections by Brahms and Mozart. And my dad said, "Yes, I know the classical music station here in Lynchburg has been playing music like that all week as well. And it's so comforting. It's like a warm bath on a cold night." Soul music soothes and it heals. Soul music is something that I believe we go to when we are at our very highest and our very lowest. It's something we turn to when we're feeling an indescribable joy, like we are walking on a cloud. And it's something we turn to when we're deep in the bottom of the depths, down into the pit. And in some cases, it's the same songs that we go to, the same compositions, when we're in those high points and in those low points. Our gospel reading tonight is one of those segments that gives us both of those aspects of life, the very highest and also the very lowest. The disciples and Jesus have gathered for a meal, and it's a time of joy and celebration. The way you all look when you're gathered around the table for a fellowship supper, enjoying one another's company and enjoying the familiar foods that are there before you. It's a time where the disciples are still basking in the joy of what they had witnessed on what we looked at the beginning of the service on Palm Sunday. That triumphal entry when Jesus comes into the city on a donkey, and they wave palm branches, and they sing, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Wasn't that wonderful? Didn't it feel like we could do anything we set our mind to? And being guys, I imagine that the disciples punched each other in the shoulder as they said, and wasn't it awesome this week when he got one over on the scribes and the Levites, who all week long had been trying to get one over on him? That look on their faces where their mouths were open and they just sat there looking dumbfounded and stupid. Can you silence them like that? And that time when they are just celebrating what it means for them to be together in this particular occasion. But it's also a time where there is a deep sense of foreboding of what is about to unfold in just an hour or so. Jesus feels it. Judas Iscariot feels it. And the rest of the disciples probably feel it on some level too. And if they don't right now, they will when they get to the Mount of Olives. When they get to that point where they witness humanity at its worst. When they are on the verge of seeing their master turned over for brutal torture and a painful death. When they realize the worst that they can experience in betrayal, in being turned around and being looked down on by other people, being jeered and being ostracized, and that heavy sense of shame and guilt that is going to be on all of them. Some of them will go away breaking down in tears. Another will take his own life. It is the lowest of the low. And in that interval, in that time between the joy and the elation of the Passover feast, of remembering the events of that week, and the anguish that they're all about to feel at the Mount of Olives, in that period between the two, they sang a hymn. According to custom, as the gospel says for us tonight, it's during that moment that they turn to their psalm music. According to custom, when Jews gathered for a Seder meal, they sang the psalms that in our version of Psalms are found between 113 and 118. It's something that would have been a part of the conclusion of this service, as they're just wrapping up and finishing their meal and spilling out the doors of the upper room and into the street on the way to the Mount of Olives. It's during that time that they would have sung what you and I read responsively earlier from 116. Here are the lyrics that we would have heard. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. Those are the lyrics that went past the lips of the disciples and reverberated off the walls of the upper room. That's the soundtrack to the Last Supper. This is soul music at its finest. And tonight, as we recite those words, we connect ourselves with their story 2,000 years ago. And we see the fullness of what you and I have experienced, our highest highs and our lowest lows. And they all come together in that moment as we bring who we are to this table. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he talks about that time when we're having trouble finding just the right words for prayer, where the Holy Spirit intervenes with sighs too deep for words. That's also where we find our soul music. That music that speaks to your soul, that talks about who you are uniquely and individually, fearfully and wonderfully made. Whatever your soul music is, celebrate it, study it, sing it, dance to it, pray with it. Because whatever